My aim for today's talk is to just share with you some of the inspiration behind the curatorial development of our 1919 exhibition upstairs, and also to share some of those stories that I found during my research that were particularly interesting to me, that though didn't necessarily make it into the exhibition space. I do only have a limited time frame in which to speak today. I'll try and keep it to about half an hour. So I will jump right in and share with you the very first newspaper article I read in my research for our newest temporary exhibition, 1919, A Time to Mourn, A Time to Hope. So this article was published in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 1st of January, 1919. New Year's Eve, a quiet night in the city. New Year's Eve was celebrated quietly in the city last night. If the passing of the year 1918 occasioned no special manifestations of regret, it also called forth no unusual displays of pleasure and delight. We are glad to see the end of the old year, because with it goes the orgy of bloodshed and strife. And with today's dawn of a new year comes what promises to be an era of peace and prosperity. And yet, during that period which is to follow, we must always feel a glow of healthy pride when we survey, in retrospect, the outstanding events of the period which closed last night, as the last sonorous stroke of midnight was wafted away on the cool southerly breeze. Right, so as I'm sure you can appreciate, I was immediately struck by the article's sentiment, so beautifully written, and immediately endeavoured to find some supporting graphics for that night. Although I was unable to find one, I did come across this wondrous photograph from the State Archives of New South Wales. So it depicts a man, presumably an employee of the New South Wales Railways, changing the clock hands at Central Station on the 31st of December 1919, so New Year's Eve 1 year hence. So as I looked at this image, I reread the article and was astounded by the poetic symmetry, as the last sonorous stroke of midnight was wafted away on the cool southerly breeze. So at this very, very preliminary point in my research, I was convinced of two things. One, that we had found the first two graphics for our exhibition, and two, that we really ought to tell the story of 1919 using those same powerful, undoctored words. That is, it was at this very early point that we resolved to use the popular media of the day, newspaper and magazine articles, to unpack 1919 from the perspectives of those who lived it. Funnily enough, though the article inspired our curatorial voice, or perhaps lack thereof, it didn't end up getting included within the exhibition. Rather, our narrative actually begins 2 months earlier, in November 1918. So on the 8th of November, Sydney's Daily Telegraph published a report that Germany had agreed to the terms of the armistice. The Great War was over. Naturally, Sydney dropped everything and commenced its long-awaited frenzy of celebrations. The report, however, was entirely false. Though the erroneous nature of the report was quickly and widely disseminated, Sydney continued to party. No other city or state in Australia did this, just Sydney. And the celebrations didn't end on the 8th, but continued on the next day, and the next day, until finally, at 7 p.m. on the 11th of November, the actual report of the capitulation of Germany was received. Unsurprisingly, Sydney threw another party on the 12th. So the story of Sydney's 5-day frenzy of marathon of parties was one we just simply couldn't ignore, especially with such newspaper headlines as "Joyous Sydney goes mad twice, based on nothing and started by nobody," and "Dinkum this time, Metropolis goes mad." But on a more somber note, hanging amongst this section's photographs of celebrations is this cartoon drawn by Hal Eyre and published in the Daily Telegraph on the 12th of November. So our inclusion of this graphic and the emotions it depicts was absolutely imperative. You might see next to the woman, the newspaper actually says "Great War over." So despite the public celebrations raging on around them, for the loved ones of the 60,000 Australians who perished during the war, this was undoubtedly the reality of the armistice. So these premature celebrations do beg the question, by early November 1918, why were the people of Sydney, and New South Wales more generally, so expectant of an imminent end to the war? So in the opening months of 1918, the Central Powers were at the zenith of their military successes. It was no secret that many feared a sudden and disastrous defeat. However, the ultimate failure of Germany's March offensive saw, by July, this position reverse. The successes of the Allied counteroffensive were, at the time, widely published. So in his speech on the 22nd of July, Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes declared that it was, in fact, the beginning of the end of the Great War. This was seemingly in direct contravention of the reports coming from Washington and London, all of which stated that the war could last well into 1920. So Prime Minister Hughes was no stranger to wild speculation, as you can see from this slide. In fact, since August 1916, Hughes seemed to continuously predict war's end within the year. Fortunately for him, he just happened to be correct this time round. So by the 5th of November, both the Ottoman Empire and Austria had left the war. Celebrations once again sprung throughout the city. It is no stretch of the imagination to imagine the people of Sydney expectantly awaited the same fate of Germany. So before I move on to the next section, I will share with you one of the more entertaining stories I came across in my research, though I in no way condone this behaviour. So during the celebrations for Austria's capitulation from the war on the 5th of November 1918, many a spokesperson climbed atop a replica destroyer in Martin Place, which you can see just on the right there. So mostly, their messages were received by the crowd with much enthusiasm and patriotic fervour. However, at one point, a representative member of the Labour Party climbed aboard and attempted to spruik Labour's role in ensuring Allied success. He was swiftly torn from his platform and accosted by an angry crowd. It was reported the next day that the returned veterans were largely responsible for the attack. So in considering that we have begun our exhibition with November 1918, you may be wondering, why develop an exhibition on 1919 at all? So although the guns fell silent on the Western Front at 11 a.m. in November 1918, the Great War was by no means ended. At the time of the signing of the armistice, almost 200,000 Australians remained overseas. For those already returned, a mass army of otherwise unemployed men and women posed new and complex social, economic, and medical issues for both state and national governments. Devastatingly, the repatriation of these forces to Australia en masse catalysed the outbreak of the influenza pandemic and, with it, the deaths of almost 15,000 Australians nationwide. Moreover, a significant number of Australians would re-engage in fighting overseas. 1919 saw new and existing battles rage in northern Russia, Kurdistan, Persia, and Egypt. More Australian lives would be lost. Australian prisoners, captured by the enemy or detained for military misconduct, also remained overseas. Perhaps more shockingly, enemy aliens living in Australia were likewise detained in various concentration camps. In New South Wales alone, 7,000 were detained throughout the war, with a majority being deported by the end of 1919. And finally, with the new year emerged a new era of peace, however relative. 1919 was indeed the year to mourn and a year to hope. So naturally, we translated these 5 points into the main themes or sections of our exhibition. So we have repatriation, the influenza pandemic and the medically unfit, the little wars of 1919, prisoners in peacetime, and understanding the war of 1914 to 1918. So for the remainder of my talk, I will quickly run through each of these sections in a bid to provide more context than what is present currently in the exhibition, and also speak to some of the stories that I found were an absolute pleasure to research. Repatriation. So the repatriation of the hundreds of thousands of servicemen and women who remained overseas at war's end was organised by Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, Corps Commander of the Australian Forces, on a first-come, first-go basis. Regrettably, a lack of transport delayed the operation significantly. For those forced to wait, life in the Army was by no means a sudden picnic. It ought to be remembered that a lasting peace with Germany was not guaranteed, and so sailors and soldiers were required to remain fit and vigilant. To this end, the AIF instituted a series of educational lectures and programs centering on skills for military occupation in peacetime. Australia would not test these skills until 1946. In this section, you will see a number of newspaper headlines which speak to the many strikes and riots of the Australian forces awaiting repatriation. These in the exhibition are juxtaposed against those reports from Monash stating that all is well with the repatriation effort. Interestingly, our celebrations for the armistice did not occur on the Western Front as they did in Australia and elsewhere around the world. Rather, the armistice came as a surprise to both commander and soldier alike. For the 100,000 men at the Western Front, the ceasefire affected little change to daily life, other than to provide respite to the deluge of bullets and shells. Access to no man's land remains strictly forbidden on both sides. For many, a political and military victory, however significant, did little to numb the effects of war at the personal level. All right, so this video depicts a soldier suffering shell shock at a British war hospital. It is not graphic, but I do want to just warn that it is quite confronting before I press play. So as you can see from this footage, the debilitating symptoms of shell shock included uncontrollable shaking, paralysed limbs, blindness, serious palpitations, extreme aggression or chronic lethargy, and loss of appetite. As many of you know, shell shock, or PTSD as it's known today, was a relatively new phenomenon in 1919. Research had only begun in earnest in 1915, and only by 1916 was it theorised to be a mental and not a physical ailment. Australia would only know the true nature of the condition as men gradually returned from the war. To celebrate the official ratification of the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1919, a victory parade would occur across all the Allied countries. Interestingly, early planning for the victory parade in New South Wales, which would take place on the 19th of July, paid special attention to veterans suffering shell shock. Throughout New South Wales, the use of crackers and other personal explosives was strictly prohibited. In Melbourne and in regional townships throughout New South Wales, public and private fireworks were also banned. In Sydney, however, the parade committee only banned crackers and bungers in densely populated areas, such as Martin Place, and, astonishingly, public and personal firework displays were entirely permitted. However, this seeming nonchalance on this occasion is an anomaly. In the main, the treatment of shell shock and other permanent disabilities within New South Wales was taken very seriously and well appointed. I will quickly share with you some of the more shocking statistics. So in all, 330,000 Australians served in the Great War, so 120,000 from them from New South Wales. So almost 2/3 of all men became casualties, the highest proportion of any force within the British Empire. At the time of their demobilisation, the majority which took place in 1919, 1/5 of all persons were declared medically unfit. By 1926, 23,000 veterans would be permanently hospitalised. A decade later, this figure had more than doubled. But globally, and in less than 1 year, the influenza pandemic killed up to 3 times more people than died in the Great War. The virus was particularly lethal for those aged 20 to 40 years. Although the pandemic broke out in mid-1918 in Europe, relative isolation in the Southern Hemisphere meant that both New Zealand and Australia were relatively well protected. However, the repatriation of troops en masse meant that the isolation was short-lived. By September 1918, both South Africa and America had been affected. Britain too had suffered its first victims of the influenza, but wartime censorship kept the outbreak under wraps. By October, the pandemic had reached New Zealand. A swift quarantine process in Australia quickly followed. And yet, despite such efforts, on the 28th of January 1919, 4 confirmed cases had appeared in Sydney. Public health declined rapidly thereafter. In all, the virus would kill 6,387 people in New South Wales alone. So one of the more shocking things I learned in my research of the influenza pandemic was heliotrope cyanosis, the condition which struck the fatally ill. As the victims' lungs filled with liquid, their nose, ears, and/or faces would turn a bluish maroon colour. Once this occurred, the victim could survive anywhere between 10 minutes and 12 hours, but none affected would survive. So to research the full extent of the pandemic in New South Wales, our curatorial team took a trip out to quarantine station at North Head. It was here that the military and civilian vessels returning to Australia and their personnel were isolated until they were cleared of the virus. For many veterans, quarantine seemed a punishment. They were, after all, so close and yet so far from home. As early as late January 1918, before New South Wales itself had been affected, 326 cases and 49 deaths were reported at Quarantine Station. The station has 3 cemeteries. Within the third, which is pictured here on the left, are interned all those who perished during the smallpox epidemic in 1881 and the influenza epidemic of 1919. Although, as you can see, the majority of the graves are now lost, a commemorative boulder erected by the RSL New South Wales lists the 14 sailors and soldiers who died during their quarantine in late 1918 and 1919. Among them is Private Peter MICHAELOVICH CHIRVIN Military Medal. With his death inscribed as April 26, 1919, I naturally assumed that he had succumbed to pneumonic influenza. Shockingly, this was not the case. Born in Vladivostok, Russia, in 1894, CHIRVIN had come to Australia as a young man, settled in Queensland, and found work as a reporter. Upon turning 21, CHIRVIN enlisted in the AIF and embarked for Gallipoli with the 9th Battalion. Transferred to the 49th Battalion in early 1916, he was twice seriously wounded on the Western Front. Homeward bound in April 1919, after serving over 4 years with the Australian Imperial Force, CHIRVIN's ship was quarantined at North Head Station. Sadly, on the 26th of April 1919, the day after Anzac Day, CHIRVIN's body was found hanging by the neck on a beam on the ship's main deck. The coroner determined his death as a cause of asphyxia from strangulation due to hanging. In other words, suicide. An inquest into CHIRVIN's death found that he had sought the confidence of 3 friends aboard the vessel. He had complained that he was horribly depressed after being heckled about his nationality. Being Russian, many called him Bolshi. His depression was compounded by his anxiety after hearing about the Bolshevik movements in Brisbane and had confessed to fearing what they would do to him upon his eventual arrival home. CHIRVIN's mother remained a resident of Vladivostok. Given the turmoil that then plagued northern Russia, all correspondence with her was conducted through the British consulate in Tokyo. In a letter addressed to War Records in 1919, Mrs. CHIRVIN wrote, "My husband is dead and I have no other children. My papers were lost during the Bolshevik disorders. I am now quite alone." So the conflict in North Russia is covered in our section on Little Wars of 1919. I am conscious of time and am by no means a military historian, so I will quickly glance over this section. But I will say that even with the 1,300 Australians still fighting in 1919, finding any reference to those conflicts in the newspapers or contemporary media of the day was particularly difficult. Although censorship likely had a role in this, in the main, it seemed that the world was more deliberately fixated on war's end and an everlasting peace. At various periods throughout the year, there were over 1,000 Australians fighting in Egypt, dozens in the Middle East, and hundreds in northern Russia. Which is why this illustration seemed perfect for this section. The world, you can see, is blanketed by the peace treaty, though he suffers a splitting headache over conflicts still raging. You might be able to see just under his hand there is written the word Russia. If you are interested in reading more on the conflicts, particularly those in North Russia, Persia, Kurdistan, and Egypt, our wonderful colleagues at the Brucey Library have put together a recommended reading list, which is now available on our website. So this section of the exhibition focuses on 3 types of prisoners in 1919: soldiers detained for military misconduct, enemy aliens detained within Australia, and Australian POWs. Today I want to focus on the latter and provide more insight into the fascinating story of Douglas Grant. Douglas Grant, or to use his birth name, Popinjeri, was born around 1885 to an Aboriginal community in northern Queensland. In 1887, when Popinjeri was still a baby, intertribal warring saw the massacre of his entire community, including his parents. As the sole survivor of the conflict, Popinjeri was found and rescued by Scottish scientist Robert Grant. An employee of the Australian Museum, Grant adopted Popin and raised him alongside his other son, Henry, between Lithgow and Annandale. Popinjeri was soon thereafter renamed Douglas Grant. So raised by 2 Scottish parents and sent with his brother to Scots College, Douglas developed a thick Scottish accent and a reverence for Scottish heritage. He had a natural talent for drawing and became a skilled draftsman. In 1897, when still a teenager, Douglas Grant took first prize for drawing in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee exhibition. He was still working as a draftsman when he first enlisted in January 1916. He was, however, prevented from embarking with the AIF by the Aborigines Protection Board and was thereafter discharged. At the time, Indigenous peoples were prohibited from serving and, shockingly, from leaving Australia. Undeterred, Grant once more enlisted and embarked for France with the 13th Battalion. On the 11th of April 1917, Grant was wounded during the First Battle of Bullecourt. He, alongside 1,170 of his fellow diggers, was captured by the enemy, though would only remain with them 2 months. Given his complexion, he was instead sent for internment with other coloured soldiers. As an Indigenous man, Grant was somewhat of a curiosity to German doctors, scientists, and anthropologists alike. He became the subject of numerous studies. This carried Grant some favour, and he did enjoy privileges otherwise denied to his fellow prisoners. So in 1919, after 22 months in a POW camp, Grant returned to Australia, where he resumed work as a draftsman and later as a worker in the small arms factory at Lithgow. Later in life, he became a lobbyist for Veterans Affairs, a radio host, taxidermist like his father at the Australian Museum, and a keen bagpiper. It is his bagpipes that we have on display, lent to us by the Australian Museum. So another fascinating aspect of the story of Douglas Grant that is not as widely known is that what happened to his brother, Henry. In 1944, a skeleton was discovered in a cave at Glenbrook. Alongside it lay a diary. From the rambling entries in that diary, it was discovered that the skeleton was in fact Henry Grant, Douglas's brother and fellow Australian Museum taxidermist. Reported missing almost 7 months prior, it was determined that Henry had starved to death in the cave. Aged 52, he had been given leave from the Australian Museum after the death of his wife, had suffered a mental breakdown and died as a result. Douglas Grant died in 1952, having never received any pension nor soldier settlement payment due to his Aboriginality. So on to the final section of the exhibition. So this section is a particularly broad one. It deals with the translation of wartime technologies to mainstream society, the establishment of battlefield cemeteries, the formation of the Royal Australian Air Force, and other sentiments of commemoration and peace. Perhaps the most relevant story covered in this section centres on the fundraising for the construction of this very building. Although fundraising had begun on Sydney's first Anzac Day in 1916, the exact purpose and form of the Anzac Memorial was, in 1919, hotly debated. It was resolved this year, in 1919, that the Anzac Memorial ought to be a place of social gathering. Aptly, the room in which the 1919 exhibition now stands was once the Assembly Room, the designated recreation space within the memorial following its completion in 1934. So for those of you yet to view the exhibition, I do hope that you keep in mind the room's form of function and imagine it filled with veterans and their families as you navigate the various sections and stories within the space. Any questions? Something that I found on this, though it's not actually available online anymore, but the RSL's publication Ravalli is an amazing source for those disability figures and actually includes the suicides. And from 1920s onwards, they do seem to just increase by a phenomenal percentage each year. So it is quite, and obviously with the advent of the Second World War as well, they just increase. I really could, I don't want to speculate too much, but it's probably something that I can find out for you and then you can, yeah, but it was less than the hospitalisation, but yes, very significant. Yeah, and just the increase throughout time was... And that's only what they knew. Exactly. Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure you saw in the exhibition just the effort of New South Wales in dealing with the influenza pandemic, especially, and the fact that the school teachers and principals and some of the schools were actually turned into hospitals. So, yeah, I think the efforts of the New South Wales government was probably could have been better, particularly in the repatriation and particularly the ongoing employment of veterans returning, but even then it seemed pretty astounding. So like I think their response wasn't, like it was actually pretty good considering it was such a new phenomenon as well. Yes, oh, absolutely. But even like from July onwards, once, everything was seemed to be turning in the favour of the Allies, like the casualties still suffered is just incredible. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.